Battlefield. They genuinely believed this would be a gentleman's war of grand maneuvers and quick surrender. This delusion reached its peak at the First Battle of Bull Run. The engagement was so close to Washington, D.C. that congressmen and socialites actually rode out in their carriages, carrying picnic baskets and opera glasses to watch the rebels be chased back to Richmond. But the celebration turned to horror as the smoke cleared. Instead of a quick Union victory, they witnessed a chaotic, bloody meat grinder. The Union lines shattered, and the panicked soldiers retreated through the crowds of fleeing civilians. The sight of blood-soaked fields and the sounds of men dying in the dirt silenced the laughter of the spectators. This was the moment the mask fell off. America realized that this wouldn't be a short-lived adventure or a heroic pageant, it was going to be a long, brutal, and agonizing struggle that would test the very limits of human endurance. As the war in the East ground into a frustrating stalemate, a different kind of conflict was brewing in the West, along the muddy banks of the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. It was here that the world first took notice of a quiet, unassuming man named Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike the cautious generals in Washington, Grant didn't believe in retreating, he believed in unconditional surrender. He began tearing through Confederate strongholds, capturing strategic forts and opening up the river ways for the Union. But the true scale of the horror to come was revealed at a place called Shiloh. In a dense thicket of woods, the two armies collided in a desperate, two-day struggle that felt less like a battle and more like a massacre. When the sun went down on the second day, over 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It was a number so staggering that it sickened the public on both sides. The Battle of Shiloh proved that the Confederacy wouldn't just fold under pressure and that Grant was willing to pay a terrifying price for victory. The war had reached a new, darker level of violence, where the objective was no longer just to outmaneuver the enemy, but to utterly destroy their ability to fight back. While Grant was finding success in the West, the war in the East was becoming a nightmare of hesitation for Abraham Lincoln. The president was desperately searching for a general who could win, but his top commander, George McClellan, was a man who loved his army so much he was terrified to actually use it. McClellan was a brilliant organizer, but he was plagued by a leadership of caution, constantly overestimating the enemy's size and retreating just when he had the advantage. This hesitation gave the South the opening they needed. Enter Robert E. Lee. Taking command of the Confederate forces in Virginia, Lee was the polar opposite of McClellan. He was bold, aggressive, and possessed an uncanny ability to read his opponent's minds. In a series of lightning-fast strikes, Lee didn't just stop the Union advance, he sent them reeling back toward Washington. For the South, this was a golden era of confidence. They began to believe that their superior generalship could overcome the North's superior numbers. As Lee's fame grew, the North fell into a deep leadership crisis, leaving Lincoln to wonder if he would ever find a commander with the will to fight before the Union completely collapsed under the weight of its own indecision. Flush with confidence from his victories in Virginia, Robert E. Lee decided it was time to take the fight to the North. He crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping a win on Northern soil would shatter the Union's morale and perhaps finally convince European powers like England to intervene. But as Lee's army marched, a stroke of pure luck changed the course of history. A Union corporal found a bundle of 3 cigars in a field, wrapped in a piece of paper that happened to be Lee's secret battle plans. This discovery gave the Union Army a rare, clear shot at the Confederate heart. On September 17, 1862, near the town of Sharpsburg, the two sides met at the Battle of Antietam. What followed was the single bloodiest day in American history. From the head-high stalks of the cornfield to the sunken farm road known forever after as Bloody Lane, the violence was relentless. By the time the sun set, 23,000 men lay dead or wounded, nearly 4 times the number of Americans lost on D-Day. While the battle was technically a tactical draw, Lee was forced to retreat. It was the slim strategic victory Lincoln needed to stop the war from being just about land, and start making it about something much more profound. Up until this point, the North was fighting a war to preserve a political map, but after the carnage of Antietam, Lincoln realized that the Union could no longer be saved unless the institution that caused the rupture was finally addressed. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a masterstroke of both morality and military strategy. By declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were, thenceforward, and forever free, Lincoln transformed the war into a crusade for human rights. This change had massive international consequences. European nations, who were on the verge of supporting the South for its cotton, could no longer justify helping a government fighting to protect slavery. Furthermore, the proclamation opened the door for black soldiers to join the Union Army. Thousands of formerly enslaved men and free black citizens rushed to enlist, bringing a new, fierce energy to the Northern ranks. The stakes had been raised to the highest possible level. The war was no longer just about whether the United States would be one nation or two, it was now a battle to decide if America would finally live up to its founding promise that all men are created equal. In the summer of 1863, Robert E. Lee made his most daring move yet, pushing his army deep into the North, all the way into Pennsylvania. He hoped that a decisive victory on Union soil would force the North to sue for peace. The two armies collided almost by accident at a small market town called Gettysburg. For 3 days, the surrounding hills and fields became the site of the most famous battle in American history. On the second day, the fate of the Union hung by a thread during a desperate bayonet charge at Little Round Top, where Northern soldiers held the high ground by the narrowest of margins. On the third day, Lee rolled the dice one last time with Pickett's charge, a massive, heroic, but ultimately suicidal infantry assault across an open field against the center of the Union line. The attack was decimated by Union artillery and rifle fire. As the survivors limped back to the Confederate lines, the high water mark of the Confederacy had been reached. Lee began a long retreat through the rain, his army broken and his dreams of an invasion crushed. Combined with a massive Union victory at Vicksburg on the very same day, the tide of the war had officially turned. The South was now fighting on borrowed time. With the tide turning, Lincoln finally found the relentless leadership he had been searching for. He promoted Ulysses S. Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant's philosophy was simple and brutal: the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can. Strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. While Grant pinned Robert E. Lee down in a bloody, suffocating war of attrition in Virginia, he unleashed his trusted friend, William Tecumseh Sherman, into the Southern heartland. Sherman's March to the Sea introduced a terrifying new concept: total war. He wasn't just fighting soldiers, he was destroying the South's ability to sustain the conflict. His troops tore up railroads, burned supply depots, and seized crops, leaving a path of destruction 60 miles wide from Atlanta to Savannah. The goal was to break the Southern spirit and prove that the Confederate government could no longer protect its people. As smoke rose over the Georgia countryside and Atlanta fell, the economic and psychological backbone of the Confederacy snapped. The South was being hollowed out from the inside, and for the first time, the end of the nightmare was finally in sight. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate dream was a smoldering ruin. Robert E. Lee's once mighty army of Northern Virginia was a ghost of its former self, starving, barefoot, and dwindled to a fraction of its size. After a grueling 10-month siege, the Confederate capital of Richmond fell, and as the rebel government fled, Lee made one final, desperate dash toward the mountains, hoping to link up with remaining forces in North Carolina. But Grant was faster. He had Lee's men surrounded on all sides near a tiny settlement called Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, Lee realized the end had arrived, famously stating, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The two men met in the parlor of a private home, Grant in a mud-splattered private's uniform and Lee in his finest dress whites. What could have been a scene of bitter vengeance instead became one of unexpected dignity. Grant, under Lincoln's guidance, offered generous terms. The Southern soldiers would not be imprisoned or tried for treason, they were simply to lay down their arms and go home. Grant even allowed them to keep their horses for the spring planting. As Lee rode away, the Union troops began to cheer, but Grant silenced them immediately, saying, "The rebels are our countrymen again." The guns finally fell silent, and the long, agonizing struggle for the soul of the nation was over. The victory was complete, but the celebration was tragically short-lived. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, while the North was still draped in bunting and flags, the nation was rocked by a final, horrific act of violence. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had carried the weight of the Union on his shoulders for 4 years, was assassinated at Ford's Theater. In an instant, the joy of peace turned into a profound, national mourning. The great emancipator was gone, leaving a scarred and leaderless country to figure out how to rebuild. The toll of the war was staggering, over 600,000 dead, millions wounded, and a South that lay in literal ashes. Yet, through this unprecedented sacrifice, the United States was fundamentally reborn. The war didn't just end slavery, it settled the question of whether a democracy could actually survive its own internal divisions. We moved from a collection of individual states to a single, indivisible nation. As I promised at the beginning, the true reward for understanding this history lies in a single letter written by a Union soldier in the final days of the war. He wrote to his family that he didn't feel like a conqueror, but like someone who had finally found his brothers again. That spirit of reconciliation, the idea that we can be broken and yet still find a way to become one people, is the true legacy of the Civil War. It is a reminder that even in our darkest moments of division, the path back to each other is always possible through grace and shared purpose. The war changed everything, ensuring that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not perish from the earth.